conspiracy. Yet men returned to these conversations again and again because scandal was irresistible. To hear secrets whispered, to watch a rival squirm, to strike a verbal blow disguised as comedy, all of this gave the symposium its edge. It was not only philosophy and poetry that drew Athenians to these parties, but also the thrill of seeing masks slip, of reputations crumbling under laughter and mockery. Thus, politics at the symposium was both entertainment and danger. It mirrored Athenian democracy itself, messy, loud, competitive, and filled with ego. The symposium may have been private, but it was never separate from the city. In the haze of wine and song, the seeds of political triumph or ruin were often planted. As the hours passed and the crater was refilled again and again, the carefully measured balance of the symposium began to wobble. What had started as polished conversation, witty songs and disciplined games often gave way to slurred speech, unsteady gestures, and eruptions of unrestrained emotion. Dionysus, the god of wine and frenzy, made his presence felt most vividly in these late stages. The line between philosophy and madness blurred. Guests who once quoted Homer with elegance might now shout half-finished verses, their words dissolving into laughter. Others, overcome with wine, grew bold in ways the sober daylight never allowed, confessing forbidden loves, insulting powerful men, or making boasts too wild to be believed. The symposiarch might still attempt to impose order, decreeing another round or demanding a song, but more often than not, he too had surrendered to intoxication. Physical chaos was common. Cups were overturned, wreaths slid askew, and couches became battlegrounds. A careless remark could spark a heated argument. An argument could escalate into thrown cups or fists. Servants scurried nervously, trying to clean up spills or calm tempers before matters grew violent. And yet, for many, this descent was part of the allure. The symposium was never meant to remain perfectly civilized. It was a controlled dive into the unpredictable realm of Dionysus. Sometimes the chaos spilled beyond the walls of the andron. A drunken band of revellers, called a komos, might stagger into the streets, singing bawdy songs, banging on neighbours' doors, and carrying torches through the night. These street parades were both feared and admired, rowdy, disruptive, but also a recognised part of Dionysian culture. To lead or participate in a komos was to wear one's drunkenness as a badge of honour. Of course, not every descent ended in laughter. Some nights brought real danger, a rivalry reignited, an insult too sharp, or a boast too threatening could end with blades drawn. The Athenians themselves acknowledged this risk. Too much wine could transform a symposium from a gathering of equals into a brawl of enemies. Yet even in its disorder, the symposium had meaning. To surrender to chaos was to embrace the god of ecstasy, to taste freedom from the rigid order of daily civic life. The descent into frenzy was both a warning and a revelation. Beneath the masks of philosophy and poetry, men were still creatures of passion, pride, and excess. By the time the oil lamps guttered low and the last notes of the flute faded, the symposium had usually run its course. Guests staggered from the andron, ivy wreaths askew, their robes stained with wine, voices hoarse from song and argument. Some collapsed into sleep on couches, unable to rise until daylight, while others spilled into the streets to join a komos, their drunken parade echoing through Athens until dawn. The morning after was rarely graceful. Servants were left to scrub floors sticky with spilled wine, gather shattered kylakes, and dispose of wreaths wilted in the night's heat. For the participants, the aftermath carried both pride and regret. A sharp remark, made too freely under Dionysus's spell, might become the subject of gossip at the agora the next day. A boast could haunt a man in court or politics. Yet the same symposium might also forge new friendships, strengthen bonds of loyalty, or cement reputations for wit and brilliance. To shine at a symposium was to elevate oneself socially, even politically. To disgrace oneself was to risk ridicule far beyond the walls of the host's home. But the symposium was more than a night of excess. It was a cultural institution, It reflected the very character of Athens: competitive, intellectual, chaotic, and creative. In the balance between wine and water, between philosophy and scandal, Athenians tested the limits of themselves and their society. The greatest ideas of Greek thought, discussions of love, justice, and the soul, were not born in classrooms, but in wine-soaked gatherings where laughter and argument mingled. Plato's symposium immortalized this truth, showing how an evening of drinking could become a meditation on the nature of Eros itself. Even after Athens' golden age faded, the spirit of the symposium lived on. Later Romans adapted it into their convivia, while echoes of it resurface in medieval banquets, Renaissance salons, and even the modern dinner party. Wherever people gather to drink, to argue, to sing, and to confess too much under the influence of alcohol, the shadow of the symposium lingers. The morning after may have left Athenians bleary-eyed, their reputations dented, their heads heavy, but the memory of the symposium endured. It was never just about the wine. It was about being human, brilliant and foolish, disciplined and chaotic, philosophical and scandalous, all in the same night. In that way, the symposium was Athens itself, distilled into a single room, a single bowl of wine, and a single unforgettable evening. Imagine standing in the dust of a battlefield, the sun blazing overhead, and hearing a sound unlike anything you've ever known, a deep, trumpeting roar that shakes the earth beneath your sandals. For a Roman soldier, this was no ordinary noise. It was the battle cry of Carthage's most fearsome weapon, the war elephant. These creatures were living towers, taller than any horse, covered in armour, with tusks capped in iron and bodies capable of flattening a line of men in seconds. To those seeing them for the first time, they might as well have been mythical beasts, closer to the monsters of Homer than to anything born of this world. The Carthaginians had turned elephants into symbols of power and terror. Imported from Africa, most were the now extinct North African forest elephants, smaller than the massive Indian variety, but still terrifying when outfitted for war. They were dressed in protective armour, with spiked or bladed tusks that transformed their natural bulk into a crushing weapon. Some even carried wooden towers strapped to their backs, holding archers and spearmen who could rain down death from above. The psychological effect of these animals was as important as their physical strength. Horses panicked at their smell, men froze at their sheer size, and the sight of an elephant charging, a wall of flesh and metal thundering forward, was enough to shatter morale before a single blow landed. This was Carthage's advantage, to terrify the enemy into breaking ranks, turning discipline into chaos. But war elephants were more than weapons. They were statements. Marching into battle with elephants declared that Carthage was no mere city-state. It was a superpower capable of commanding nature itself. When generals like Hamilcar or Hannibal deployed them, the message was clear. You were not just fighting soldiers. You were fighting gods of war made flesh. Still, the Romans quickly realized these beasts were not invincible. Their size made them slow, their behavior unpredictable. But in this opening moment, before tactics, before countermeasures, before men adapted, the war elephant stood as the most terrifying shock force of the ancient world. They were not simply animals. They were a roar in the dust, a living nightmare, and for Carthage a weapon meant to crush the will of Rome. Transforming a wild elephant into a weapon of war was no easy feat. Carthage didn't simply unleash untamed giants onto the battlefield. It carefully trained them to become extensions of its army. Captured in the forests and plains of North Africa, young elephants were brought into camps where specialized handlers, called mahouts, began the long process of shaping their behavior. These men lived almost every moment beside the animals, feeding them, grooming them, and most importantly, teaching them to obey commands in the chaos of battle. Training an elephant was equal parts discipline and trust. The mahout guided the animal with vocal calls, prods, and even iron hooks, conditioning it to respond instantly. Elephants learned to march in formation, halt at signals, and charge on command. They were acclimated to the sounds of war, the clash of bronze, the blare of trumpets, the screams of soldiers. Fires were sometimes lit near their pens, so the beasts grew accustomed to smoke and shouting. The goal was simple: make sure that when the elephant faced the madness of battle, it did not panic and turn against its own side. Armour added another layer of preparation. Craftsmen fitted elephants with bronze or leather headpieces, chest plates, and tusk sheaths tipped with sharp blades or spikes. These modifications transformed the already fearsome creatures into juggernauts. On their backs, wooden towers, known as howdahs, were secured with ropes and straps, carrying 2 to 4 soldiers armed with javelins, bows, or long spears. In this way, each elephant became a mobile fortress, both shock weapon and elevated firing platform. But the most important training was psychological. Mahouts taught elephants to channel their aggression outward. They were driven to frenzy before battle, sometimes by being given wine or being pricked with sharp objects, ensuring they entered the fight already worked into a rage. Once unleashed, they could trample infantry lines, scatter cavalry, and crush fortifications. Of course, the risks were immense. No matter how well trained, an elephant was still a wild animal. If injured or terrified, it might turn back and rampage through its own army, causing as much destruction to friend as to foe. Carthaginian generals understood this gamble, but they also understood the payoff. When properly handled, war elephants were more than beasts. They were terror-made flesh, the first shockwave in a battle plan meant to unnerve and overwhelm Rome before swords even clashed. The first appearances of Carthage's war elephants stunned enemies across the Mediterranean. In the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, when Carthage fought its rivals in Sicily, North Africa, and Iberia, elephants quickly became its signature weapon. Against lightly armoured infantry or cavalry unused to such beasts, their effect was devastating. Imagine a Greek hoplite phalanx, trained to hold the line against men, suddenly confronted with an animal weighing several tons, trumpeting, charging, and crushing everything in its path. Spears splintered, shields were knocked aside, and horses bolted in terror. One of the earliest documented uses was during Carthage's campaigns in Sicily against Greek city-states. Here, the elephants were unleashed to break through heavily defended positions, scattering men before them and leaving gaps that Carthaginian infantry could exploit. They were not merely weapons of destruction, but tools of strategy, softening up an enemy line before the decisive clash. Their appearance became so iconic that Greek writers often described them with awe, comparing them to living siege engines. In North Africa, elephants were equally effective. Against rebellious tribes or rival armies unfamiliar with the beasts, they instilled instant fear. Even when they didn't kill in large numbers, the psychological shock of their presence often decided battles before they truly began. Enemies sometimes fled at the mere sight of them, unwilling to test their courage against these colossal adversaries. Yet the early successes also revealed their limitations. In narrow terrain, elephants could be trapped or avoided. Clever opponents set ambushes, targeting the mahouts or wounding the animals until they panicked. But when deployed on open fields, where there was space to charge, they were nearly unstoppable. Carthage, learning quickly, began to shape its battlefield tactics around their use, combining elephants with disciplined infantry and swift cavalry to create a combined arms strategy that few enemies could match. These early victories cemented elephants as more than just exotic beasts. They became symbols of Carthaginian power. Other nations might have strong infantry or swift cavalry, but only Carthage had elephants, and that gave them a terrifying edge. For Rome, watching these encounters from across the sea, the message was clear. One day, they too would face these living towers. And when that day came, no amount of drill or discipline could prepare them for the shock of a charging elephant line. No story of Carthaginian elephants is more legendary than Hannibal's audacious march across the Alps during the Second Punic War. In 218 BC, Hannibal set out to strike at the very heart of Rome, not by sailing across the Mediterranean, but by leading his army, infantry, cavalry, and elephants over the treacherous mountain passes of Gaul and into Italy. It was a gamble so outrageous that even today it feels closer to myth than history. The elephants, around 37 in number, were not just animals in this march. They were symbols of defiance. To Hannibal, They were meant to terrify the Romans before a single spear was thrown. Imagine the spectacle. Colossal beasts trudging through icy paths, their bulk silhouetted against snow-covered peaks, drivers urging them forward as avalanches thundered in the distance. For the soldiers alongside them, exhausted and freezing, the elephants were proof of their commander's iron will. If these creatures could endure the climb, so too could men. But the journey was brutal. Narrow trails barely wide enough for men had to be hacked open for the elephants. Slippery slopes threatened to send them plummeting into ravines. The cold was relentless. Beasts used to African heat shivered in the mountain winds, their trunks raised helplessly against the snow. Food was scarce, and keeping such massive animals fed and watered was a near impossible task. Some elephants perished on the journey, collapsing from exhaustion or tumbling to their deaths. Yet many survived. When Hannibal finally descended into the Po Valley in northern Italy, the sight of elephants emerging from the mountains shocked the Roman world. These were not just soldiers arriving on their border, but monsters of war, carried over landscapes the Romans had believed impassable. The psychological impact was enormous. News spread like wildfire. Hannibal had brought living fortresses into Italy itself. Though the march had cost Carthage dearly, the symbolism was worth its weight in gold. The elephants were proof of Hannibal's genius, his willingness to do what no other commander dared. They did not simply arrive as weapons, they arrived as omens. Rome now faced not just an enemy army, but one led by a man who could bend nature itself to his will. In December 218 BC, Hannibal's gamble with the Alps bore fruit at the Battle of Trebia, his first major clash with Roman forces on Italian soil. After weeks of manoeuvring, he finally lured the Romans into open battle near the Trebia River in northern Italy. Exhausted, half-frozen, and hungry from crossing the icy waters at dawn, the Roman legions found themselves facing not only Hannibal's disciplined army, but also his surviving war elephants. Though their numbers had dwindled since the Alpine crossing, the elephants still played a decisive psychological role. Stationed on Hannibal's flanks, the beasts became walls of flesh, towering over Roman cavalry. At the signal, they charged, trumpeting, tusks glinting with metal caps, trampling forward as archers atop their backs rained missiles into enemy ranks. For many Roman soldiers, this was their first direct encounter with elephants, and panic rippled through the lines. Horses bolted at the smell and sound of the animals, throwing cavalry units into chaos before they could even engage. The Romans tried to counter with discipline, bracing shields and thrusting spears upward. Some elephants fell under the barrage, pierced and maddened, but even in death they sowed destruction, collapsing onto soldiers, crushing shields and men alike. Those that survived rampaged unpredictably, scattering formations that relied on tight cohesion. Once the lines were fractured, Hannibal unleashed his cavalry and hidden reserves, surrounding the disoriented Romans and cutting them to pieces. Though the elephants were not the primary killers, their impact was undeniable. They destabilized the battlefield, turning Roman order into confusion, softening the enemy just long enough for Hannibal's tactical genius to deliver the decisive blow. Ancient sources note that after Trebia, the Romans were left shaken not only by defeat, but by the memory of those colossal beasts roaring through their lines. The image of elephants crushing soldiers into the frozen mud lingered long after the battle ended, but the victory came at a cost. The harsh Italian winter and lack of fodder proved disastrous for Hannibal's elephants. Most of the animals that had terrified Rome at Trebia soon perished in the cold months that followed, leaving him with only one survivor by spring, a massive creature nicknamed Surus, said to be his favourite. Yet even as their numbers dwindled, their legend grew. Hannibal had shown Rome that elephants were more than weapons. They were instruments of fear, capable of bending even disciplined legions to chaos. By the spring of 217 BC, Hannibal's once imposing herd of elephants had been whittled down by cold, hunger, and disease. Only a single survivor remained, a massive beast remembered by the Carthaginians as Surus, meaning the Syrian. Whether the name referred to his breed, his origins, or simply his appearance is debated, but Surus became more than an animal. He was a symbol of Hannibal's resilience and defiance in the heart of enemy territory. Surus was said to have been the largest and most imposing of the herd, possibly a war elephant of Syrian or Indian stock acquired through trade, rather than the smaller North African species. His sheer size and endurance set him apart. Roman sources claimed that Hannibal even used Surus as a kind of battlefield platform. With his vision failing from an eye disease, the general supposedly directed armies while perched on Surus's back, shaded beneath a canopy and elevated above the chaos. Whether this detail is fact or legend, it underscores the deep impression the elephant left on contemporaries. On the battlefield, Surus carried more than just Hannibal. He carried morale. For the Carthaginian soldiers who had endured the horrors of the Alps, his survival was proof that their cause was favoured by the gods. To the Romans, he was a living reminder of the terror at Trebia, a hulking shadow of Hannibal's earlier victories. Even alone, he amplified the aura of Carthage's commander, transforming him into a figure who seemed untouchable, larger than life. But despite Surus's symbolic power, he was still only one elephant. As Hannibal advanced deeper into Italy, fighting at Lake Trasimene and eventually Cannae, elephants no longer played the decisive role they once had. The Italian climate, the lack of proper fodder, and the relentless pace of campaigning made it nearly impossible to keep such beasts alive in the long term. Surus, though beloved, could not reverse that reality. Eventually, even his legend faded into uncertainty. Sources fall silent on when or how he died, but his story lived on as the emblem of Hannibal's daring. While Rome adapted and developed strategies to neutralize elephants, Surus remained the haunting memory of their first devastating encounters. In many ways, he was not just Hannibal's last elephant in Italy. He was the last echo of Carthage's boldest gamble to terrify Rome into submission. At first, Rome had no idea how to fight elephants. Legionaries trained to face men with swords and spears suddenly found themselves staring down charging towers of muscle and ivory. Their initial instinct was to panic, and Hannibal exploited that fear brilliantly. But Rome was nothing if not adaptable. By the later years of the Second Punic War, Roman commanders had developed clever countermeasures that transformed the elephant from a weapon of terror into a liability. One of the simplest tactics was to open lanes in the legion's formation. When elephants charged, instead of holding a solid line, Roman soldiers stepped aside, creating corridors that funneled the beasts harmlessly through the ranks. Once past, the elephants could be harassed with javelins and slings until they either collapsed or fled. The key was discipline, resisting the urge to scatter and instead turning chaos into controlled maneuver. Roman missile troops also became crucial. Velites, lightly armed skirmishers, were trained to target elephants specifically. They hurled spears at sensitive points: the eyes, the trunk, the underbelly. Even if these wounds did not kill the animal outright, they caused pain and panic. A wounded elephant often turned back on its own lines, wreaking havoc on the Carthaginian infantry standing behind it. The Romans realized that the elephant's greatest strength, its size and ferocity, could also be turned into its greatest weakness. Another brutal tactic was psychological warfare against the animals themselves. Trumpets, horns, and even the blaring clash of shields were used to spook the beasts, making them uncontrollable. In some battles, pits were dug and disguised with brush, designed to trap charging elephants in the ground before they reached Roman lines. Against cavalry, Rome deployed spiked caltrops, iron devices meant to maim the elephant's massive feet. Perhaps most importantly, Rome adapted its mindset. The first time soldiers saw elephants, they viewed them as monsters. By the later campaigns, they treated them as just another enemy unit to be neutralized. As Roman discipline hardened, the terror factor diminished. In the end, elephants that once shattered Roman armies at Trebia were far less effective in later encounters. Rome's genius lay not in avoiding defeat, but in learning from it, turning initial panic into seasoned preparation. By the final years of the war, the sight of elephants no longer promised Carthaginian victory. Instead, they had become unpredictable gambles, as likely to trample their own men as to crush Rome. By 202 BC, the Second Punic War had dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Hannibal, recalled from Italy, faced Rome's rising general Scipio Africanus in North Africa. The 2 greatest commanders of their age would clash at Zama, a battle that would decide the fate of Carthage. And once again, elephants would play their part. Hannibal had assembled around 80 of them, hoping to repeat the terror of Trebia and Trasimene. It was one final gamble to break Roman lines and reclaim the initiative. As the battle began, the elephants were driven forward in a massive charge. Dust filled the air as the ground thundered beneath their feet, tusks gleaming with metal tips, trumpets echoing like thunderclaps across the plain. To Carthage, it was a show of overwhelming force. To Rome, it was a familiar test. This time, Scipio was ready. He had studied Hannibal's tactics for years, and he knew the elephant's weaknesses. Instead of forming a solid wall, Scipio ordered his legions to open corridors in their ranks. At the same time, his trumpeters blared horns to unsettle the beasts. Confused, many elephants veered into the gaps harmlessly, charging through empty lanes before being driven off with javelins. Others, spooked by the noise, turned back in panic, trampling Carthage's own cavalry and sowing chaos in their rear lines. The once feared living tanks became liabilities. Only a handful made contact with Roman soldiers, and even then, they were quickly overwhelmed by disciplined spear formations. The rest either bolted or were cut down. What was meant to be Hannibal's opening blow collapsed into disorder before the real fighting even began. Without their elephant shockwave, Carthage lost the psychological edge. The battle turned into a clash of infantry and cavalry, where Scipio's superior tactics and Numidian allies carried the day. Hannibal's army was crushed. Carthage was forced into humiliating peace terms, and the age of Carthaginian elephants effectively ended. At Zama, the war elephant met its reckoning. What had once terrified Rome now symbolized Carthage's desperation. Rome had learned, adapted, and conquered. The beasts that had shaken legions to their core at Trebia and Trasimene could no longer decide the fate of battles. Instead, they became the tragic icons of a fading empire, remembered not for their triumphs, but for their final, futile charge. With the defeat at Zama, Carthage's war elephants faded from the battlefield, but their legend endured long after their trumpets fell silent. They had been more than beasts of burden or exotic curiosities. For nearly a century, they were Carthage's most iconic symbol of power, living fortresses that carried both glory and danger into every campaign. The elephant embodied Carthage's strengths and weaknesses. On one hand, they projected dominance. No other Mediterranean power could field such a terrifying weapon with such regularity. Their presence struck fear before a battle even began, and for years Rome trembled at the thought of facing them. On the other hand, they revealed Carthage's reliance on spectacle. Elephants were unpredictable, expensive to maintain, and devastating when they panicked. At Zama, they showed that Rome's discipline could turn even Carthage's most fearsome weapon into a liability. Still, their impact on history cannot be overstated. The sight of elephants marching across the Alps with Hannibal became one of antiquity's most enduring images. Roman poets, historians, and generals retold the story for centuries, turning those beasts into symbols of audacity and terror. Even after the animals themselves disappeared from Carthaginian battlefields, their memory lived on as cautionary tales about the limits of brute force. Rome itself adopted elephants occasionally, but never with the same devotion. They used captured beasts in triumphal parades, and sometimes in battle. But the lesson of Zama remained. Discipline and adaptability mattered more than spectacle. As the empire expanded, elephants became less weapons of war and more emblems of victory, paraded in the arenas for public entertainment rather than unleashed on foreign fields. The Carthaginian elephant, then, occupies a unique place in history. It was both terrifying and flawed, magnificent and impractical. To Carthage, it was a gamble worth taking, an effort to bend nature into a weapon that might offset Rome's rising power. To Rome, it was a challenge that forced innovation, shaping the discipline that would define their legions for centuries. In the end, war elephants did not save Carthage, but they did secure its place in legend. Whenever we think of Hannibal, of Carthage, of the ancient struggle against Rome, the image that rises first is not of infantry or cavalry, but of elephants, colossal, armoured, trumpeting in the dust, charging toward destiny. In the medieval world, bread was not just food. It was the foundation of existence, the one staple that tied together the lives of peasants, clergy, and nobles alike. A man might go days without meat, cheese, or even vegetables, but he could not live without bread. To run out of loaves was to flirt with starvation, and whole communities measured the rhythm of life by the grain harvest, the mill, and the oven. For the poor, bread was often coarse and dark. Rye, barley, and oats were the grains most accessible to peasants, producing loaves that were dense, sour, and sometimes flecked with husks or straw. These black breads filled the stomach, but offered little in the way of refinement. In hard times, households stretched their flour with beans, acorns, or even ground-up weeds, an act of desperation that made the bread heavy and bitter. Eating such loaves was a reminder of one's low station, but also of resilience. Even when life offered little else, bread kept bodies working in the fields and children alive through winter. For the wealthy, bread told an entirely different story. Nobles and clergy consumed the finest white loaves, baked from carefully sifted wheat flour. This bread, known as manchet in later centuries, was soft, light, and expensive to produce. To be served white bread at a banquet was as much a symbol of status as wearing silk or owning a war horse. The colour itself was a marker of privilege, bright, pure, and far removed from the dark, heavy loaves of the village oven. Bread was also central to ritual. At meals, loaves were often used as trenchers, thick slices that doubled as plates, soaking up meat juices before being eaten, or given to the poor as charity. At Mass, bread transformed into the body of Christ, elevating the daily staple into a symbol of divine grace. Thus, from peasant huts to cathedral altars, bread linked survival with spirituality, sustenance with ceremony. Above all, bread carried weight as a political force. A failed harvest or inflated bread prices could spark riots. Lords and kings who failed to provide grain risked rebellion, for to deny bread was to deny life itself. In every crust and crumb lay a truth medieval people knew too well. Bread was not merely something you ate, it was the essence of life, power, and order in the medieval world. For medieval peasants, bread was both comfort and burden. It made up as much as 70 to 80% of their diet, eaten at nearly every meal, yet the quality of that bread was often far from appetizing. Poor households rarely had steady access to fine wheat flour. Instead, their loaves were made from rye, barley, oats, or a rough mixture of whatever grain the harvest had yielded. The result was bread that was dark, coarse, and heavy, more a block of sustenance than a delicate food. This peasant bread was sour from natural fermentation, baked dense and filling to stretch every grain as far as possible. Because the Lord controlled the mills, villagers were often required to grind their grain there, paying fees for the privilege. Afterward, they baked their loaves in communal ovens, sometimes paying in kind with a portion of the finished bread. The very act of eating, then, was bound up in systems of power and obligation. During lean years, when harvests failed or grain prices soared, peasants had little choice but to stretch their flour with substitutes. Beans, peas, chestnuts, or acorns might be ground in. In times of true desperation, even weeds, ground straw, or powdered bark were added. Such loaves were bitter, hard, and sometimes even dangerous, causing illness if improperly prepared. Yet to go without bread was worse, so these desperate mixtures became survival food in times of famine. Despite its humble quality, bread was versatile. A crust might be dipped in broth, eaten with cheese, or used to soak up vegetable stews. Leftover bread could be boiled into pottage, or dried and crumbled into other dishes. Even when stale, it still served a purpose. For the poor, Nothing was wasted, not a crumb. There was also a symbolic element to bread among the poor. The act of breaking bread at the table, however meagre, carried with it a sense of family and community. Sharing a dark loaf in a peasant cottage bound people together as surely as fine wheat bread did at a noble feast. Bread was life, and even the simplest black loaf had dignity in its role. For the medieval poor, bread was both chain and lifeline. It represented their dependence on the land, their obligations to their lords, and the limits of their social status. Yet it was also the daily anchor of existence, a constant presence at the heart of survival. If the poor endured dark, heavy loaves, the wealthy enjoyed bread as a symbol of refinement and privilege. For nobles, clergy, and the merchant elite, the daily loaf was not simply about survival, but about status. The most prized bread was baked from fine, sifted wheat flour, free of husks and impurities. This bread was pale, soft, and delicate, so unlike the coarse black loaves of the village oven that it might as well have been an entirely different food. Known in later centuries as manchet, white bread was costly to produce. Milling wheat finely took time and skill, and the demand for purity meant discarding much of the grain that peasants would never waste. Only those with wealth could afford such extravagance, making the whiteness of bread itself a badge of class. A noble's table groaned with venison, poultry, and spiced sauces, but the gleaming white loaves were just as much a marker of privilege. To be served this bread was to be reminded of one's place in the social order. At banquets, bread was more than food, it was tableware. Large, thick slices of coarse but decent quality loaves were cut into trenchers, which doubled as edible plates. Meat, sauce, and gravy soaked into them during the meal. Afterward, trenchers might be eaten by the diners, or, more often, collected and distributed as alms to the poor waiting outside the castle gates. In this way, bread connected the excess of the nobility with the hunger of the peasantry. Bread also played a central role in ritual. At great feasts, loaves might be carved into decorative shapes, stamped with the Lord's seal, or presented in elaborate baskets to display wealth and generosity. In monasteries and cathedral chapters, fine bread was part of daily rations for higher clergy, while lower-ranking brothers ate darker loaves. Even within the church, the quality of one's bread reflected one's rank. To nobles, bread was comfort and symbol alike. It reassured them of their superiority and gave them a chance to display charity by passing leftovers to the needy. But the contrast was stark. While peasants chewed through gritty rye, nobles savoured soft white wheat loaves with honey or butter. In every bite lay a reminder of hierarchy. Bread may have been universal in the medieval world, but not all bread was equal. For the wealthy, it was proof that life could be savoured, while others merely endured it. If bread was the solid foundation of medieval life, ale was its liquid companion. Morning, noon, and night, it flowed across every social class, from peasant cottages to noble halls. But this was not the potent beer of modern pubs. It was small ale, a mild, low-alcohol brew consumed daily in place of water. In an age when rivers and wells were easily fouled by waste, ale was safer to drink, the brewing process killing off harmful bacteria. To medieval people, it was not indulgence, it was necessity. For peasants, small ale was often home-brewed, made in simple cottages with whatever grains were available, barley, oats, or rye. The result was a cloudy, earthy drink, weak in strength, but rich in calories, providing liquid sustenance for labourers working from dawn to dusk. Children drank it as readily as adults, and it was poured at every meal. A peasant's day might begin with bread and ale, continue with pottage and ale, and end with, you guessed it, more bread and ale. In towns and cities, ale houses became central to daily life. These establishments offered more than drink. They were meeting places, gossip hubs, and makeshift community halls. A penny bought a mug of small ale, affordable even to the working poor. But while ale kept bellies full and quenched thirst, it also provided brief respite from the grind of medieval life. Laughter, song, and camaraderie flowed as freely as the drink itself. The wealthy, too, consumed ale, though of finer quality. Nobles often had dedicated brew houses on their estates, producing stronger, clearer brews flavoured with herbs or even early hops. For them, ale was paired with roasted meats and rich feasts, not just bread and cheese. Yet even in a lord's hall, small ale was the standard drink of servants, squires and guests alike. Brewing was typically women's work. Known as alewives, women managed the household brewing, selling surpluses to neighbours or markets. Their role in sustaining communities was vital, though often overlooked. Without them, daily life would grind to a halt, for without ale, thirst and disease would quickly follow. Ale was more than drink. It was cultural glue. It nourished bonded communities and offered comfort across the social spectrum. In every mug, from the rough-hewn wooden cups of peasants to the pewter tankards of knights, lay the same truth. Medieval life ran on bread and ale, the twin pillars of survival. To understand medieval ale, one must step into the smoky kitchens and backroom brewhouses where it was made. Brewing was not yet an industrial process, but a domestic craft, overseen primarily by women. Known as alewives, they brewed for their families first, and for neighbours or markets if there was surplus. In many villages, the skill of a good alewife was as valued as the skill of a good baker, for without her, thirst and sickness loomed. The process began with grain, barley if available, though oats, rye or wheat could be used. First, the grain was malted, soaked in water, allowed to sprout, then dried in a kiln. This released sugars that could later ferment. The malt was then ground and mixed with hot water to produce a thick porridge-like mash. From this, brewers drained the sweet liquid known as wort, which held the essence of the ale to be. Boiling came next. In large cauldrons, the wort was simmered with herbs for flavour and preservation. Before hops became widespread in later centuries, brewers relied on mixtures called gruit, blends of herbs like yarrow, bog myrtle, rosemary and juniper. These gave medieval ale a sharp, sometimes medicinal taste, very different from the crisp bitterness we know today. Once boiled, the wort was cooled, then poured into open tubs where natural yeasts in the air sparked fermentation. The result, after a few days, was ale, ready to drink while still fresh and frothy. Unlike modern beer, medieval ale was not stored long. It soured quickly, often within days, so it was brewed frequently in small batches. A household might brew several times a week, ensuring a constant supply. Stronger ales could last longer, but the small ale that fueled daily life was meant to be consumed fast, before it spoiled. Brewing was not only domestic, but commercial. In towns, alewives sold their brews openly, sometimes marked by signs like a broom or greenery hung over the door. Authorities regulated prices and quality, for bad ale was not just unpleasant, it was a public hazard. A watered-down batch or spoiled brew could cause anger, fines, or even punishment. In the medieval world, brewing was both art and survival. It demanded skill, patience, and knowledge passed down through generations. Every cup of ale was the product of human ingenuity harnessing grain, fire, and fermentation. It was the drink that turned harvests into sustenance and kept medieval society running, one bubbling vat at a time. At every meal in the medieval world, whether in a peasant's hut or a noble's hall, two constants held sway: bread and ale. They were not simply side dishes or accompaniments, but the backbone of daily eating, the reliable staples that framed every bite and sip. For the poor, a meal often began and ended with bread. A crust of coarse rye or barley loaf was dipped into a bowl of pottage, a thick stew of beans, peas, onions, and whatever scraps of vegetables or meat were available. Ale washed it down, mild enough for children, hearty enough for men labouring from dawn to dusk. It was a diet heavy on sustenance and light on luxury, but it kept people alive and working. In many households, ale was brewed in such small batches that each day's jug was finished by nightfall, leaving nothing wasted. In contrast, Noble tables offered bread in a variety of forms. Fine white wheat loaves were set before lords and ladies, while darker breads were reserved for servants and lesser guests. At great feasts, trenchers, thick slices of bread, were used as edible plates. These caught the juices of roasted meats and spiced sauces, soaking up flavour until they were eaten at the end of the meal, or collected and distributed to the poor as alms. The presence of multiple bread types at one table visually reinforced the hierarchy of the medieval world. Status was tasted as well as seen. Ale, too, was ever present. In castles, brewhouses produced stronger, clearer ale for the lord's table, sometimes flavoured with imported spices or herbs. Servants and soldiers drank small ale, the everyday brew that quenched thirst and nourished bodies. At feasts, great pitchers of ale flowed alongside wine, the latter reserved for the wealthiest or for special occasions. Even so, ale remained the true drink of daily life, trusted over water and cherished as part of every shared meal. Meals were rarely silent. Bread was broken, ale poured, and conversation flowed with it. Stories, gossip, and even political negotiations conducted over loaves and mugs. In monasteries, silence ruled the refectory, but even there bread and ale were constants, tying the lives of monks to those of the people beyond their cloisters. At every level of society, bread and ale transformed eating from a simple act of survival into a communal ritual. They were nourishment, but also symbols of labour, privilege, faith, and fellowship. To sit at a table without them would have felt unthinkable, almost unnatural in medieval daily life. Bread and ale were not only the staples of daily life, they also carried deep spiritual meaning in the medieval world. In a society where religion shaped every rhythm of existence, even the most ordinary loaf or jug of ale became symbols of faith, ritual, and divine provision. Bread, above all, held sacred significance. In the Christian liturgy, it was transformed during the Mass into the body of Christ, a miracle that elevated the humble loaf into the centerpiece of worship. Every medieval person, whether peasant or noble, knew that the bread they ate each day mirrored the bread consecrated at the altar. The words, "Give us this day our daily bread," were not metaphorical. They were as literal as they were spiritual. To go without bread in life was hunger. To go without the sacred bread was eternal peril. Ale, though not elevated to the same status, still had its place in religious life. Monasteries were famous for their brewing, providing not only sustenance for monks, but also hospitality for pilgrims and travellers. Within those cloisters, brewing was considered part of holy labour, turning grain into nourishment that supported both body and community. Monks brewed in staggering quantities, producing both small ale for daily consumption and stronger brews for feast days or guests of high rank. Their reputation for purity and quality made monastic ale some of the most trusted in Europe. Fasting practices also reflected the centrality of bread and ale. On days when meat and dairy were forbidden, bread became the primary staple, often eaten with vegetables or fish. Ale remained acceptable, providing calories during long fasts that might otherwise have weakened the body. It blurred the line between food and drink, reinforcing its role as daily fuel blessed by God's providence. Even beyond church walls, bread and ale were woven into rituals of community and charity. At weddings, loaves and ale were shared to mark fertility and abundance. At funerals, bread and drink were distributed to mourners, binding the living together in grief and remembrance. Feasts in honour of saints often centred on the distribution of bread and ale to the poor, transforming everyday staples into instruments of mercy. In this way, bread and ale were more than nourishment. They were bridges between the earthly and the divine. Every bite of bread, every sip of ale reminded medieval people that their survival was both a gift of labour and a blessing from above, tying the physical act of eating to the eternal drama of faith. For all their centrality, bread and ale were never guaranteed. A poor harvest, a harsh winter, or war could transform daily staples into luxuries overnight. In medieval Europe, food shortages were frequent, and when the supply of grain faltered, life grew precarious. Bread, the essence of survival, suddenly became a measure of crisis. The first sign of scarcity was price. In villages and towns, the cost of grain climbed steeply when yields failed. Families who relied on buying flour or loaves soon found themselves priced out of the market. Anger at bakers and millers often followed, as people suspected hoarding or profiteering. Bread riots erupted in bad years, for to deny the people their loaves was to provoke desperation. Authorities sometimes stepped in with price controls, but enforcement was patchy at best. Hunger spread quickly when grain supplies thinned. When flour ran short, peasants turned to substitutes. Rye and barley replaced wheat, producing darker and denser loaves. In dire times, flour was stretched with beans, peas, or chestnuts, which added bulk but little taste. More desperate measures included acorns, ground straw, or even bark. These famine breads were heavy, bitter, and sometimes poisonous if improperly prepared. Accounts from the Middle Ages describe villagers gnawing on loaves so rough they cut the mouth, a cruel reminder that survival came at a price. Arlay, too, was vulnerable in famine. Without barley or oats, brewing faltered. Families might water down their ale to make it last, or switch to rough herbal drinks. In some cases, desperate peasants brewed ale from whatever they could find, fermenting roots, fruits, or even weeds. The result was weak, sour, and often unsafe, but it was better than nothing. Alehouses suffered as much as households, their business collapsing when grain supplies failed. Scarcity also revealed hierarchy. While peasants starved on bark bread, nobles often still ate fine wheat loaves imported at great expense. Lords had the wealth to secure supplies, monasteries hoarded grain for their own communities, and the poor bore the brunt of famine. This inequality could fuel rebellion, as hungry villagers turned against the very lords who should have protected them. Famine left scars not only on bodies, but on memory. Generations remembered the bitter taste of substitute bread, the gnawing hunger, and the helplessness of watching stores run dry. Scarcity made clear the fragile balance of medieval life. When bread and ale vanished, so too did stability, reminding everyone that survival depended on the mercy of harvests. Bread and ale were more than food and drink. They were the foundation of medieval existence. From dawn until dusk, they sustained every class of society, shaping not just diets but economies, rituals, and even politics. Centuries later, their legacy still lingers, in our language, our traditions, and the very idea of what it means to share a meal. Bread was the ultimate symbol of life itself. Its centrality is reflected in medieval law and religion, where ensuring grain supplies was a duty of kings and lords. To control bread was to control society, for no one could live without it. Even today, phrases like breadwinner or our daily bread echo its role as the essential measure of sustenance. In the Middle Ages, a man might live on little more than coarse loaves, and a noble might dine on delicate wheat bread, but both understood that without bread, life unravelled. Ale, too, left a mark that endures. It was not the refined, hoppy beer of modern Europe, but a simpler, cloudier drink, more nourishment than indulgence. Its presence in every home, every monastery, and every tavern made it the social glue of the medieval world. Alehouses became centres of gossip, trade, and local politics, while monastic breweries laid the foundation for Europe's later beer culture. The reliance on ale over water reveals a truth about medieval life. Safety, health, and survival were bound up in the brewing kettle. Together, bread and ale shaped medieval identity. They were the common thread linking peasant cottages, noble feasts, and monastic cloisters. They marked the rhythms of life, from the trenches of banquets to the loaves broken as alms for the poor, from the morning jug of small ale to the sacred bread at Mass. They were not luxuries but constants, reminders of both human fragility and resilience. When famine struck, their absence tore at the fabric of society. When they were plentiful, they gave stability, even joy. The memory of their scarcity haunted generations, ensuring that grain stores and brewing vats were guarded as fiercely as castles. In the end, the legacy of bread and ale is not just about taste or sustenance. It is about survival, community, and culture. To break bread and share ale was to affirm life itself. In medieval Europe, no act was more universal, no habit more enduring, than reaching for a loaf and raising a cup.